Constructing Knowledge, the program that changes how we know the world. I'm your host, Mark Strathy, and I'm pleased to have renowned painter Phillip Pearlstein as my guest. Known for his frank and unromantic visions of the human figure, Pearlstein has revolutionized figure painting in the realistic mode, using figures as mere props that are equal in status to the antique statuary surrounding them. Pearlstein has chosen to eliminate narrative from his paintings. As the critic Robert Hughes stated in a review of his work, realism, we learn once more, is neither a simple nor an easy matter. His work is known throughout the world and has been exhibited in most major arts institutions in America and Europe. Phillip Pearlstein is represented in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and many other prestigious collections around the world. In total, Pearlstein's paintings are in the collection of 63 museums. Phillip Pearlstein is represented in New York by the Betty Cunningham Gallery, and we're pleased to have him here back at Brooklyn College. You retired here in 1987, and you worked here for about 25 years?
Well, it was close to that. I think I started in 1964, 63 or 4.
Yeah, and I was a student of yours from 1982 to 1984. So
right
that's
near
how
the end.
I got to know.
Right.
That was right near the end of your
Right.
time here, right? But you started your artistic career in
High school.
in high school
In high school.
in Pittsburgh,
In Pittsburgh.
and you went to the Carnegie Institute.
Well, after high school, I went to what was then called Carnegie Institute of Technology, for 1 year. I had my freshman year, and then I was drafted into the Army and spent the next 3 years in the Army. 2 of those years were spent in Italy.
Right.
Right. But in the Army, I picked up a lot of skills, strangely enough. I was a rifleman, but for a while I was also doing charts and diagrams about weapons, how to use them, how to break them down, clean them, and so on. Simple instruction, visually.
And we have an image of your some of the things you did in the
Army.
In the Army. You call it your genre period, where you were
Right.
drawing the soldiers, and you were kind of. What do you mean by genre period?
Well, it was just ordinary, everyday, for me at the time, everyday activities of the training of an infantryman,
yeah,
low level.
right. And they were kind of. You would call it kind of illustrational, the kind of
Right,
work you were doing at the time.
They were straightforward, simple illustrations. Nobody had a camera then. I'm not even sure we would have been allowed to have cameras, but I kept a visual record of my whole 3 years in the Army.
In the Army, yeah. And you were you were stationed in Italy.
Well, my first year was here in the United States, mostly in Florida, northern Florida, in a big swamp area. And after basic infantry training, I was transferred into a unit that did was called visual aids, where, as I say, we illustrated how to use the weapons and so forth, which gave me a lot of skills that I relied on for years after that.
Yeah.
About drafting and composition. And we silk screened them, so it was also an introduction to printmaking. And that lasted for about 6 months, and then I was put back into the infantry and took basic training all over again.
But they saw that you were an artist, and they kind of put you in a situation that was not.
No, once I left that unit, I was just an ordinary soldier in training again.
So do you want to talk about what and you were able to travel around in Italy when you were in the Army?
The group I was with landed in Italy, where we were to be casualty replacements. at the Battle of Monte Cassino.
Is that right?
But the battle had ended a couple weeks before we got there, fortunately. So we took training all over again for the next couple of months. And I did a lot of those drawings during that period.
Well, but also you were able to see all the European, all the Italian art, and the Renaissance.
That came later. Curiously, the British had a team of art historians who, after every town was taken over by the Allies, they would bring out the work that was had been put away for safekeeping, and they would put an exhibition on in the local churches, and they would publish little catalogs in English. And I still have some of them. So it was basic art history in early Renaissance to high Renaissance painting. And within
But was the Uffizi open, and
that was after the war ended, after the fighting ended, after the first year I was there. I did spend a lot of time outside of Rome in a big army camp, also training again, infantry training. And but every night we were able to, and weekends, we were able to go into Rome, and the Vatican Museum was open, and a number of collections had been brought together in one central location in the, what's it called, the Palazzo Venezia, where Mussolini had his headquarters. There was an absolutely marvelous exhibition of high Renaissance art, and I remember being especially knocked out by Velasquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X. And I think that had a crucial...
And you were about 19 years old?
19, 20.
How do you think the art in Italy that you saw when you were 19 affected what you did when you came back to the United States?
It affected me in the long range. I never thought of giving up the tradition. I wanted to continue that tradition, to bring it up to date. Even during the period where it was called white dead man's art, I wanted to keep that tradition going. And in spite of all the isms that came along in the early and late 20th century, although I did try to work as an abstract expressionist for a number of years.
Well, you also, I read that you were able to climb up and see the Last Supper when it was sandbag. It was covered with sandbags, Da Vinci's Last Supper.
No, after the war ended, because I'd never been in combat, I'd just been taking training to go into combat as a replacement. You were dismissed, you were sent home on a point system. I only had 1 point, which had to do with the length of time I was in the army. So I was kept on in Italy for just about a full year after the combat ended. And I worked as a sign painter during that period. But we had a lot of freedom to move around.
Still in Italy? You're still
in Italy.
Yeah.
And I was assigned to an engineering company that maintained the highways between Rome and Florence. And we were stationed near Pisa. And so I was able to get into Florence pretty often. And then after a while, we got to travel all over Italy. Got to Venice, Milan, Genoa.
So you saw everything.
Saw as much as I could.
Yeah.
And I should mention, we also, while we were still down around Monte Cassino, able to make trips on weekends by the courtesy of the Red Cross. So I saw Pompeii and
is that right? Wow.
paintings in Pompeii, which probably had the greatest influence on me.
More so than the Renaissance painting?
More so than the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was about the rediscovery of the ancient art and literature.
Well, I can kind of see those Pompeian figures and your figures in a way, the way those figures were frozen in time too. I mean, even the figures that are covered with lava or something.
Right,
are kind
and
of
even I realized that 18th and 19th century art, all those French artists like Ingres, who went to, what was it called, the
Academy, the Beaux-Arts Academy, or the
no, the Academy in Rome.
Yeah.
They knew these ancient paintings. They studied them, and that's where their art came from, highly influenced by them. Which is almost never mentioned in the history books, by the way, on 19th century art.
And so you went to, then did you go to the Carnegie Institute on the GI Bill? Or?
No, I came after the war, after I finally got back to the United States. I'd been in the Army 3 years, and I went back to college, to Carnegie Tech on the GI Bill. And most of the class was made up of, people like me, veterans, Army veterans on the GI Bill. But there were a couple young people in the class, the right age. Like one was Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol, right. You were classmates with Andy Warhol. And then you moved to New York with Andy Warhol also.
Well, after 3 years, we went to New York to to find careers in the commercial art world, because nobody then could conceive of a career as a fine artist. But I found there were such people in New York. There was a whole art scene, a group of artists taking themselves very seriously, and many of them became very famous in a short time. Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, and Jackson
Yeah, because
Pollock.
this is the time when you moved to New York. Abstract expressionism was kind of
was just emerging.
Yeah,
being shown in galleries.
So Rothko and Pollock and
there was this kind of underground world of art, which soon got above ground and became quite famous by the end of the 1950s. But Andy and I graduated Carnegie in 1949, and we left Pittsburgh a week after graduation and moved to New York. And to get jobs as commercial artists. Andy is an illustrator. I wanted to be a what's called an art director. I was more ambitious.
You were both kind of going in more of a commercial art direction at that time.
Totally commercial art.
Yeah.
But then I got a job as an assistant to a very important graphic designer whose name was Ladislav Sutnar. And I worked for him for the next 7 years. But he encouraged me to go back to school and study art history. He said American art students are badly educated. He was teaching at Pratt at the time. So I still had time on the GI Bill, and I got accepted to the New York University Institute of Fine Art.
Yeah, that's kind of unusual for an artist to be, to have an art history. You're more of an art historian.
I think they accepted me because my tuition was being paid for by the government. And but I had no business being there.
But did you ever really think that you would become an art historian, or were you always going to be an artist? Or
no, I wanted the background. That's what looking at all that old art in Italy gave me, was an incentive to understand what it was all about. And at the time, the Institute of Fine Art had this great faculty of these professors who all had come to America as refugees. during the late 30s or during the war years.
The Institute of Fine Art, just as a sidebar here,
Right.
is at New York University, and it's the #1 place for art history now. I mean, I don't know if it was back then.
It
but
was back then.
It was back then
Yeah.
too. So I mean, it's sort of the #1 place where you can
Right.
get your PhD now in art history.
Right. Well, I got the MA.
The MA.
It took
right.
me 5 years. I
Uh-huh.
had absolutely no qualification to be an academic.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know how to read. I didn't know how to take notes. I didn't know how to use a library.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know the English language that well. And I learned English, the construction of the English language actually through studying French. I didn't know there were tenses.
Like diagramming sentences and all
right,
that kind of grammar
future conditional, all that stuff. At
stuff. You
any
did grow
rate,
up in Pittsburgh, actually, so you were.
I mean, I was a comic book reader
Yeah.
before that. But I
So-
did okay. I learned. I
So you
survived.
you went in that direction. So were you surprised at with the direction that Andy Warhol went, or
Well, no, Andy, for the first 10 years in New York, stuck to illustration.
he stuck? Yeah, he was more.
By the end of those 10 years, of course, he was #1 illustrator in the country.
yeah.
The pop art thing developed after that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
But which is a natural outgrowth of illustration and graphic art. I mean, that he would
well,
kind of
it's-
go and develop pop art.
Yeah,
too.
except the whole scale of what you do is totally different as a painter.
Right. It's kind of recontextualizing
Right.
for a gallery.
Right, but a lot of what Andy Warhol and, say, Rauschenberg did came out of their experience of going to printing plants to see their work reproduced.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the printing plants, when they clean the rollers at night of the ink, they run paper, clean, just newsprint paper.
Just to soak up the ink. Kind
to
of.
soak up the ink over and over and over, and it collects all these images from the rollers accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
You get an accidental collage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Rauschenberg picked up on, and also Andy.
Mm-hmm.
The printing process itself
Right.
had a great deal to do with pop art.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And
So what is your relationship with pop art, do you think, as far as
well,
your
I
own
don't
work goes?
know if I had a relationship with pop art as such, but while I was still rooming with Andy,
Now, where was your...
we were in New York on, well, we first started it on 8th Street, which was called St. Mark's Place, right near Tompkins Square.
Uh-huh.
And then that had been a sublet for the summer, and then we found a place, a very interesting place, in a dance studio on, I think it was 23rd Street.
Which was more like an open space where you could...
It was a big
Paint and
Well,
stuff?
we didn't have the studio. We had the front room that the dance studio was behind,
Uh-huh.
and it was over an old fire engine house. But the woman who we let the place from was the daughter of a very famous anthropologist, whose name I can't think of now, who was though he was very
not
famous.
Leaky.
What?
Not Leaky.
No. At any rate, she was a brilliant woman, modern dance, extremely modern dance. And she was at that point also getting the idea of using dance movement as physical therapy for what was then called disturbed
And
children.
that's what was going on behind you?
That
or
was
in-
going on behind us.
Uh-huh.
So I got a job working with Mr. Suttner. I'd be away from the studio all day.
Doing more graphic design kind of things.
We did catalogs primarily. I worked mostly on catalogs for American Standard Sanitary Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
Every time
Toilets.
I see a urinal in the men's room,
Right.
it related. Incidentally, that's what led me to choose the artists Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp as the subject matter for my thesis when I was studying art history.
I remember you mentioning Mondrian and Picabia as big influences in your
Well, Mondrian is the god of
ideas.
layout artists.
Mm-hmm.
If you study Mondrian, you can do page layout and make it exciting for yourself. You're doing a Mondrian-esque composition.
But you always said that kind of had something to do with the way you composed your figurative paintings, too.
Right. Well, all of that fed into my attitudes towards painting. But while I was still living with Andy, I started working on a painting on my own time in the evenings. I'd been very taken with a painting I saw near Pisa, in Pisa, at the Campo Santo, the cemetery attached to the cathedral in the Leaning Tower. And there's this great wall painting, early Renaissance, of the Triumph of Death, this huge black figure angel with a scythe and all these dead people all around.
Yeah, Bruegel did a great Triumph of Death painting, too.
It was a popular subject.
Yeah.
I didn't know it then, but I decided to do my own version of that, and I had the Angel of Death over New York City.
Uh-huh.
Then I decided to do a whole series of flying figures.
Right, I've seen reproductions of that. That's a little more kind of a cartoon. It's more of a cartoony.
More cartoony.
It's not like your normal style.
No, but the series ended up with the painting of Superman, which is the only one I kept. But I had the American Eagle and a few other things. Mm-hmm. I also threw in the Statue of Liberty. Mm-hmm. And I even did a painting of a dollar sign.
Yeah.
Then I got married, and Andy went his way. I went off in my direction.
Yeah, because in your early work, like the painting of Superman, I think we have a reproduction of that here. You're kind of combining pop art and abstract expressionism.
Well, there was no pop art then.
Right, but I mean, you were kind of preceding pop art in a way.
But all of this got defined in my head when I went to the Institute of Fine Arts I started a year later, in 1950, in the fall of 1950, and realized that symbolism was so important. That's what the Institute of Fine Art was all about,
of course,
symbolism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when I took Duchamp and Picabia for my subjects, for my thesis, it was because they were using all these little machine things from catalogs, just like the ones I had been drafting all the time. And of course the Duchamp urinal made a direct connection. But I had to find what it meant to them, the symbolic.
Yeah, that's a really interesting confluence of ideas.
And then as I was getting all this material together, this was during my third year at the Institute for my thesis, Picabia died. And the Institute was contacted about, does anybody know anything about Picabia? And because they were totally forgotten about by that time. Duchamp and Picabia had been big during World War I.
Yeah, the 1920s.
Yeah, in the 1920s. And then dropped off the map. Mm-hmm. And
well, they were doing such esoteric work that it really didn't, it was ahead of its time.
Right. But at any rate, I did the article before I did the thesis. And the thesis was all about the symbolism of Picabia and Duchamp. I'm not sure they really had that symbolism, but it's curious that what I came up with has stuck. It's become part of
Is that right?
the standard interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you were saying that the art magazines were calling you to get an article about Picabia
Right.
because he had just died. So, and where did that get published? You said it was
It got published in a magazine called Arts
Arts.
with lots of reproductions. It was
Mm-hmm.
an important article at that moment. And if I had decided to become a writer on art history, it would have been a great beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But I always wanted to be a painter.
So were you ever tempted to be an abstract when you were in New York? You know,
Yeah,
abstract
yeah.
painting was all the rage. So were
Well,
you
it
ever
became
tempted?
that. Gradually, during that first year in New York, both Andy and I became aware of the fact that there was this other art world going on,
The fine art world.
the
right.
fine art world. And
Yeah.
when I was at the Institute, I heard about this new discussion group that had started up at NYU downtown by Robert Motherwell, which became the Artists Club.
Mm-hmm.
And every Friday night they had panel discussions with all these
He was
people
kind-
like de Kooning and Franz Klein.
He was
on
kind of the
panel.
intellectual of the
Yeah.
abstract expressionist.
It
Wasn't
was a terrific. It was for me. It was a continuation of the graduate school program, but they only discussed basic art problems about painting and sculpture, and nothing political was allowed, nothing outside. They just stuck to their subject, and people like Clement Greenberg, the art historian, Harold Rosenberg, and
Mm-hmm.
others led the discussions. There were. It was great.
They were just kind
Great
of
education.
free flowing
Right,
discussions.
but they also became the audience for this group of little galleries that suddenly began to spring up, where artists got together, paid the monthly rent on a space, and exhibited their work.
Right, you exhibited in one of the first co-op galleries, or
Right,
so-called,
on 10th Street,
on the 10th Street Gallery.
and it was very. I mean, they compared to the galleries today, they were very primitive. But there was no heat, no maintenance of any kind.
This was called the 10th Street Gallery, right? Or
Ours was called the Tanager Gallery.
the Tanager Gallery, okay.
But in the same building, de Kooning was. No, he was in the building next door, upstairs, and.
But this is a time when there were only a handful of galleries in New York. I mean, now
Right.
there's
Well, the
500.
established galleries were showing this older group.
Mhm.
I mean, there were only 5 or 6 galleries at that point,
Right, there was hardly any.
and they weren't interested, curiously, in artists under the age of 40.
Is that right?
For them, it was a cutoff point.
Established, they wanted to
It
establish.
took you that long to decide what kind of artist you were.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what they thought. And so
So what were you
it was
showing?
curious. Most of the artists involved, the men, had all been veterans of the war. Nobody spoke about the war. It was one of those forbidden subjects. But we had all had that experience, or most of us. And I think that fed into the expressionist element of the painting at that time.
Okay, I think we're going to continue this conversation, but thank you, Philip. That concludes our program. Join us again for our next episode of Constructing Knowledge. Good night.
Okay.